in the mists of ancient time, before Scotland bore its name. The land north of Hadrian's Wall harbored peoples whose stories would weave together into the tapestry of a nation. The Romans called them Caledonians, painting them as fierce warriors who melted into forests and mountains like shadows at dusk. These early inhabitants left no written records of their own, speaking to us instead through standing stones, hill forts, and the echoes of battles fought against imperial legions who never quite managed to subdue the northern reaches. The Picts emerged from this ancient foundation as the most enigmatic of Scotland's early peoples. Their name, bestowed by Roman chroniclers, meant painted people, though whether this referred to tattoos, war paint, or decorated clothing remains one of history's countless small mysteries. They controlled most of what would become Scotland from roughly the 3rd century onwards, establishing kingdoms that stretched from the Northern Isles down to the 4th. Stone speaks where words have vanished. Across the landscape of eastern Scotland, the Picts left their most enduring legacy in carved symbol stones that continue to puzzle archaeologists and historians. These monuments bear intricate designs of animals, mirrors, combs, and abstract symbols whose meanings dance just beyond our understanding. The stones stand in churchyards and fields, some towering twice the height of a person, their surfaces covered with serpents, eagles, bulls, and mysterious geometric patterns that might have conveyed lineages, territories, or spiritual beliefs. The artistry of these carvings reveals a sophisticated culture far removed from the barbarian stereotypes perpetuated by Roman writers. Pictish metalworkers crafted elaborate silver chains and brooches, while their stonemasons developed techniques that produced some of the finest sculpture in early medieval Europe. At places like Aberlimno and Meagle, the stones clustered together, suggesting these sites held special significance, perhaps as royal centers or sacred grounds where important ceremonies unfolded beneath northern skies. Pictish society organized itself around powerful kingdoms, the most prominent being Fortry in the north and Fib in what would later be called Fife. Their kings ruled from hill forts and coastal strongholds, maintaining authority through a combination of military might and religious sanction. The Picts followed a system of matrilineal succession, where royal blood passed through the female line, a practice that would later provide crucial legitimacy for Kenneth MacAlpin's plan to unite the Pictish and Scottish thrones, while the Picts dominated the eastern and northern regions. The western seaboard witnessed the arrival of a people who would lend their name to the entire nation. The Scotties sailed from Ireland somewhere around the 5th century, establishing the kingdom of Dalriada along the western coast. These Gaelic-speaking colonizers brought with them not just a new language, but an entire cultural framework that would gradually spread eastward across the land. Dalriada straddled the North Channel, maintaining territories in both Ulster and what is now Argyll. The kingdom's heart lay at Dunad, a rocky outcrop rising from the flat expanse of Kilmartin Glen. Here, it's carved into the living rock at the summit. Visitors today can still see the footprint where tradition holds that kings were inaugurated, placing their foot in the impression as a symbol of their marriage to the land itself. The Scots brought Christianity with them, or at least strengthened its presence in a land where the new faith had already begun to take root. Columba, that towering figure of Celtic Christianity, arrived from Ireland in 563, establishing his monastery on Iona. From this tiny Hebridean island, monks spread out across the north, carrying not just the gospel, but also literacy, art, and new forms of political organization that would fundamentally reshape society. The relationship between Picts and Scots began as one of conflict and competition. They fought over territory, raided each other's settlements, and competed for influence over the smaller peoples scattered throughout the region. Yet, geography and circumstance slowly pushed them toward convergence. Both faced pressure from Angles and Saxons expanding northward from the kingdoms that would become England. Both confronted the growing threat of Viking raiders who began appearing along their coasts, in increasing numbers. Language provides one of the clearest windows into this gradual merger. Pictish, whatever its exact nature, disappeared entirely, leaving only traces in place names. Rivers and mountains retained their ancient designations. Their meanings obscure, but their sounds preserved in names like Aberdeen, where the prefix Aber marks the mouth of a river in the lost Pictish tongue. Meanwhile, Gaelic spread steadily eastward, carried by monks, merchants, and ultimately by political union. The process of convergence accelerated through royal intermarriage. Pictish princesses married Scottish princes, creating dynastic connections that blurred the boundaries between the two peoples. These marriages were not mere political arrangements, but strategic moves in a complex game where bloodlines determined legitimate rule. Children of these unions could claim heritage from both traditions, positioning themselves as bridges between communities that had once viewed each other with suspicion. Christianity acted as another binding force, providing a shared religious framework that transcended ethnic boundaries. The Church offered a common ritual language in Latin, a shared calendar of feast days and fasts, and an administrative structure that ignored the divisions between Pict and Scot. Monasteries became centers of learning where young men from different backgrounds studied side by side, gradually forming an educated elite with more in common with each other than with their respective peoples. The northern and western islands added another layer to this complex ethnic mosaic. Orkney and Shetland maintained close ties with Scandinavia, their populations more Norse than Celtic in culture and language. The Hebrides became a contested zone where Gaelic and Norse influences mingled, producing a unique hybrid culture that would persist for centuries. These island communities developed their own identities, connected to but distinct from the mainland kingdoms. In the great valleys and straths of the Central Highlands, smaller tribes and kindreds maintained their own traditions while navigating the political currents flowing around them. They shifted allegiances as circumstances demanded, sometimes aligning with Pictish kings, sometimes with Scottish rulers, always seeking to preserve their autonomy in a world of expanding kingdoms. These groups would later form the basis of the Highland clan system, their ancient loyalties and feuds echoing through centuries. The landscape itself shaped how these various peoples interacted. Mountains and lochs created natural boundaries that preserved local distinctiveness, while river valleys and coastal routes facilitated trade and cultural exchange. The Great Glen, cutting diagonally across the highlands, served as both barrier and corridor, separating communities while providing a route for armies, merchants, and ideas to travel between east and west. Fortifications dotted the landscape, from massive hill forts to small defended homesteads, testament to an age when security required constant vigilance. These structures served not just as military installations, but as centers of power where chiefs dispensed justice, distributed resources, and maintained the social bonds that held communities together. The remains of these fortifications still crown hilltops throughout Scotland, their weathered stones bearing witness to forgotten sieges and ancient councils. The economy of these early peoples revolved around cattle, the universal measure of wealth in Celtic society. Cattle raiding was not mere theft, but a ritualized form of competition through which young warriors proved their worth and leaders, teamed demonstrated their ability to protect and provide for their followers. The great cattle drives, moving herds from winter lowland pastures to summer mountain grazing, established patterns of movement that would continue into the modern era. Agricultural practices evolved to match the challenging northern climate. Oats and barley grew in small fields laboriously cleared from forest and moorland. The introduction of the moldboard plow, probably during the 8th century, allowed cultivation of heavier soils, expanding the amount of productive land. Communities developed sophisticated systems for managing common resources, regulating grazing rights, and ensuring that even the poorest members had access to basic necessities. Metalworking reached extraordinary heights of sophistication. Smiths forged weapons and tools, but also created objects of breathtaking beauty. Cannular brooches, decorated with intricate interlacing patterns, fastened the cloaks of nobles. Silver chains of remarkable complexity adorned the necks of high-ranking individuals. These objects served not merely as decoration, but as portable wealth, diplomatic gifts, and symbols of rank and achievement. The spiritual life of these early peoples blended ancient beliefs with Christian doctrine. Holy wells, sacred groves, and special stones retained their significance even as churches rose beside them. The Celtic Church developed its own distinctive practices, maintaining closer ties to nature and ancient tradition than its Roman counterpart. Saints took on attributes of older deities, their feast days coinciding with pre-Christian festivals, their miracle stories echoing ancient myths. As the 8th century waned, all these disparate elements began coalescing into something new. The distinction between Pict and Scot grew increasingly meaningless as intermarriage, shared religion, and common enemies pushed them toward unity. The stage was set for a transformation that would create a new kingdom, one that would take the name of the Scots but incorporate the lands, peoples, and traditions of many nations. This emergent synthesis was not inevitable, but resulted from countless individual decisions, conflicts, and accommodations. Chiefs chose whom to support in succession disputes. Monks decided which manuscripts to copy and preserve. Farmers determined which traditions to maintain and which to abandon. Through these myriad choices, a new identity slowly emerged, one that was simultaneously Scottish and something entirely novel, a fusion of Celtic, Pictish, and British elements that would provide the foundation for a nation. The ancient North thus bequeathed to Scotland not a single heritage, but a complex weave of traditions, languages, and peoples. This diversity, often a source of conflict, would ultimately become a defining strength, creating a culture capable of absorbing new influences while maintaining its distinctive character. The Picts vanished as a distinct people, but their legacy lived on in the landscape, in place names, and in the genetic heritage of the Scottish people. The Scots gave their name to the nation, but they too were transformed by their fusion with the peoples they encountered. Maritime connections shaped these early societies in ways that would echo through Scottish history. The sea was not a barrier, but a highway connecting Scotland to Ireland, Scandinavia, and the Atlantic world beyond. Skilled navigators in skinned boats and wooden vessels traversed dangerous waters, carrying not just trade goods, but ideas, technologies, and artistic styles. The distinctive curvilinear art that adorned so many early Scottish artifacts shows influences from across the Celtic world. It's testament to these far-reaching connections. Seasonal rhythms govern life in these northern lands. Winter brought long nights when communities gathered around hearth fires to hear stories that preserved historical memory and cultural values. These oral traditions, passed down through generations, maintained knowledge of genealogies, legal precedents, and territorial boundaries. Professional storytellers, the predecessors of later Highland bards, held positions of honor, built memories serving as living libraries for societies without written records. The role of women in these early societies, while often obscured by male-centered historical sources, appears to have been more prominent than in many contemporary cultures. Pictish matrilineal succession suggests women held significant political importance. Female saints like Bridget commanded reverence equal to their male counterparts. Archaeological evidence reveals women buried with valuable grave goods, including weapons, indicating some held warrior status or ceremonial military roles. Technological innovations spread gradually through these communities. The introduction of water mills for grinding grain freed labor for other tasks and increased food production efficiency. Improved iron smelting techniques produced stronger tools and weapons. The development of more sophisticated looms allowed creation of complex textured fabrics that provided better protection against a harsh northern climate. Each advancement built upon previous knowledge, creating an accumulation of practical wisdom that enhanced survival in a challenging environment. Legal systems developed to manage disputes without constant recourse to violence. While laws were not written down, they were memorized and transmitted by specialists who served as living repositories of juridical knowledge. These laws addressed everything from murder and theft to marriage contracts and inheritance rights. Compensation, rather than punishment, formed the basis of most legal remedies, with elaborate scales determining the payment owed for various offenses based on the social status of both perpetrator and victim. From this crucible of cultures emerged the beginnings of Scotland, a nation that would carry forward the accumulated wisdom, artistry, and fierce independence of all its founding peoples. The merger of Pict and Scot was not merely a political convenience, but a genuine synthesis that created something new while preserving elements of what came before. This pattern of absorption and transformation would characterize Scottish history through the centuries. As the nation continued to incorporate new influences while maintaining its essential character, the year 843 marks a pivotal moment in the Northern Realm. Though, like most medieval dates, precision dissolves into probability, the closer one examines the evidence. Kenneth MacAlpin, known in Gaelic as Kenneth MacAlpin, ascended to rule over both Picts and Scots, creating what would become the Kingdom of Alba. The manner of his ascension remains shrouded in competing narratives, some speaking of legitimate inheritance through Pictish matrilineal custom, others whispering of treachery in the massacre of Pictish nobles at a banquet where floors gave way to hidden pits. Whatever the truth of his methods, Kenneth succeeded in what none before had managed, uniting the two primary powers north of the Fourth Clyde line under a single crown. He moved relics of Columba from Iona to Dunkeld, establishing a new religious center, safer from Viking raids that had begun plaguing the western shores. This act was more than mere pragmatic relocation. Symbolically united the spiritual heritage of Dalriada with the Pictish heartlands, creating a sacred geography that reinforced political unity. The Vikings had arrived in Scottish waters in the late 8th century, the longships first appearing as isolated raiders, but soon becoming a permanent presence that would reshape the political landscape for centuries. These Norsemen were not merely destroyers, though destruction certainly followed in their wake. They were traders, settlers, and kingdom builders who established a lasting presence in the islands and coastal regions. Orkney and Shetland became thoroughly Norse, while the Hebrides developed into a mixed realm where Gaelic and Norse cultures intertwined. The pressure of Viking raids forced the emerging Scottish kingdom to adapt and consolidate. Fortifications were strengthened, military organization improved, and alliances carefully cultivated. The Norse presence created a triangular dynamic in northern Britain, with the Scots, the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to the south, and the Norse settlements all vying for territory and influence. This complex interplay would fundamentally shape Scottish development over the following centuries. Kenneth's successors faced the challenge of maintaining unity while defending against external threats. His son, Constantine I, fought against Viking invasions, but died in battle against them in 877, possibly at the Battle of the Black Cove in Angus. Yet, even in defeat, the kingdom endured, demonstrating a resilience that would become characteristic of Scottish sovereignty. Each king who followed had to balance internal consolidation with external defense, slowly building institutions that could survive the death or defeat of individual rulers. The reign of Constantine II, who ruled from 900 to 943, marked the true consolidation of the Scottish kingdom. His extraordinarily long reign, remarkable for the violent standards of the age, allowed for the development of more stable governmental structures. He successfully defended against Viking attacks, formed alliances with various Norse leaders when advantageous, and even extended Scottish influence southward into what is now northern England. Under his rule, the term Scotia began to be applied to the kingdom north of the Forth, marking a linguistic shift that reflected political reality. The kingdom Constantine shaped was not a unified nation in any modern sense, but rather a collection of regions bound together by personal loyalty to the king. Local rulers, called mormaers, governed provinces with considerable autonomy, providing military service and tribute to the crown, while maintaining their own courts and customs. This system balanced central authority with regional power, creating a flexible structure that could adapt to changing circumstances without completely fragmenting. Religious authority intertwined with secular power in complex ways. The church provided not just spiritual guidance, but also administrative expertise, literacy, and connections to the wider European Christian community. Bishops and abbots often came from royal or noble families, their appointments serving political as well as religious purposes. Monasteries functioned as economic centers, managing vast estates, preserving learning, and providing social services that no other institution could match. The Celtic Church gradually gave way to Roman practices, though the transformation took generations and never entirely erased older traditions. The celebration of Easter, according to Roman calculation rather than Celtic custom, became a marker of this shift. But beneath such formal changes, local practices persisted. Saints' cults proliferated, often centered on holy wells or ancient sacred sites that had been Christianized. These local devotions provided communities with distinct identities while remaining within the broader framework of Christian orthodoxy. Succession remained a persistent challenge, with the Scottish kingdom following a system called tanistry, where the throne passed not necessarily from father to son, but to the most suitable male within the royal kindred. This system, designed to ensure competent adult rulers, often led to violent competition between different branches of the royal family. Brothers fought brothers, uncles contested with nephews, and succession disputes could simmer for generations, occasionally erupting into civil war. The Battle of Carham in 1018 marked a crucial expansion of Scottish power southward. Here, Malcolm II defeated a Northumbrian army, securing Scottish control over Lothian, the rich agricultural region between the Forth and Tweed rivers. This acquisition brought a predominantly English-speaking population under Scottish rule, adding another layer of linguistic and cultural complexity to the kingdom. Lothian would become economically crucial, its fertile fields and proximity to England, making it a center of trade and cultural exchange. Malcolm II's reign also saw strategic dynastic maneuvering that would have lasting consequences. Having no sons, he arranged for his grandson Duncan to succeed him, breaking with traditional succession patterns. This decision would lead to decades of conflict, but also demonstrated how Scottish kingship was evolving from tribal leadership toward dynastic monarchy. The old ways persisted in tension with new models of royal authority borrowed from Anglo-Saxon and continental examples. Duncan, the first reign proved brief and troubled, culminating in his defeat and death at the hands of Macbeth in 1040. The historical Macbeth bears little resemblance to Shakespeare's tragic villain. He was a legitimate claimant to the throne through tanistry, ruled for 17 relatively peaceful years, and was secure enough in his power to undertake a pilgrimage to Rome in 1050. His reign demonstrates its continued vitality of traditional succession practices, even as the kingdom modernized in other ways. The defeat of Macbeth by Malcolm III, known as Canmore, or Great Chief, in 1057 initiated a new phase in Scottish history. Malcolm had spent years in exile at the English court of Edward the Confessor, absorbing Anglo-Saxon administrative practices and cultural norms. When he returned to claim his throne, he brought with him ideas about kingship, law, and government that would gradually transform Scotland. Yet he was also thoroughly Celtic in many ways, speaking Gaelic as his primary language and maintaining traditional relationships with Highland chiefs. Malcolm's marriage to Margaret, an Anglo-Saxon princess fleeing the Norman conquest of England, proved transformational. Margaret, later canonized as Saint Margaret of Scotland, brought continental religious reforms, liturgical practices, and cultural refinements that would reshape the Scottish court. She established ferries for pilgrims, founded churches, and introduced new forms of charity and poor relief. Her influence extended beyond religious matters to include trade, education, and artistic patronage. Margaret's reforms were not universally welcomed. Many saw them as foreign impositions that threatened traditional Scottish customs. The tension between innovation and tradition, between European integration and Celtic distinctiveness, became a recurring theme in Scottish history. Margaret navigated these tensions with considerable skill, adapting her reforms to local conditions while gradually shifting the kingdom toward mainstream European practices. The Scottish Church, under Margaret's influence, began establishing stronger connections with Rome, while maintaining distinctive local features. New religious orders arrived, bringing architectural innovations, agricultural techniques, and scholarly traditions. Dunfermline Abbey, favored by Margaret, became a center of learning and royal ceremony, eventually serving as the burial place for Scottish kings. These monastic foundations became engines of economic development, clearing forests, draining marshes, and introducing new crops and farming methods. Trade expanded during this period, with Scottish merchants venturing to England, France, and the Low Countries. Wool became a significant export, beginning Scotland's long relationship with textile production. Towns slowly developed around royal castles and religious centers, though Scotland remained overwhelmingly rural compared to more urbanized regions of Europe. These nascent burghs received royal charters granting trading privileges, laying foundations for the merchant class that would later play crucial roles in Scottish development. The administration of justice evolved from purely personal and arbitrary decisions toward more systematic approaches. While written law codes remained rare, customary laws were increasingly standardized and professionalized. Royal officers, called judices, began appearing in the records, suggesting a more formal judicial system emerging alongside traditional methods of dispute resolution. The king's peace gradually extended throughout the realm, though local lords retained considerable judicial authority within their territories. Military organization reflected both Celtic traditions and new influences. The household warriors of the king and great lords formed a professional corps of armies, while general levies could be called from the wider population for defensive wars. Castles began appearing, initially simple wooden structures on earthen mounds, but gradually developing into stone fortifications that would dominate the landscape. These castles served not just as military strongpoints, but as administrative centers where royal authority was made tangible. The Gaelic language remained dominant throughout most of the kingdom, though regional variations were considerable. In Lothian and the southeast, English speakers maintained their linguistic traditions. In the far north and the islands, Norse speakers created their own cultural sphere. This linguistic diversity would have profound implications for Scottish identity, creating a kingdom where multiple languages and cultures coexisted, sometimes peacefully, sometimes in tension. Cultural production flourished despite the violent tenor of the times. Sculptors continued the tradition of stone carving inherited from the Picts, though styles evolved to incorporate Romanesque influences. Metalworkers produced elaborate jewelry and religious objects that combined Celtic interlace patterns with continental designs. Manuscript illumination reached high artistic levels, with Scottish scriptoriums producing books that were valued throughout Europe. Music and poetry remained primarily oral traditions, though their influence on Scottish culture was profound. Professional poets maintained genealogies, praised patrons, and preserved historical memory through carefully crafted verses. These bardic traditions would continue for centuries, particularly in Gaelic-speaking regions, providing cultural continuity even as political structures changed. Musicians traveled between courts, carrying melodies and styles that created shared cultural experiences across linguistic and regional boundaries. Women's roles in this society, while circumscribed by medieval norms, included significant spaces for influence and authority. Besides Margaret's well-documented impact, noble women managed estates during their husbands' frequent absences, negotiated marriages that were crucial diplomatic tools, and sometimes ruled as regents for minor sons. Religious life offered additional opportunities, with abbesses controlling substantial resources and wielding considerable spiritual authority. By the end of the 11th century, Scotland had transformed from a collection of competing peoples into a recognizable kingdom with established borders, cushioning institutions, and a distinctive identity. The fusion of Pictish, Scottish, Norse, and English elements created a unique political and cultural synthesis. This kingdom was still rough by contemporary European standards, lacking the sophisticated bureaucracy of England or the urban development of the continent, but it possessed a durability that would enable it to survive challenges that destroyed other medieval kingdoms. The foundations laid during this period would support Scottish independence through centuries of pressure from its more powerful southern neighbor. The mixture of Celtic tradition and European innovation, of centralized authority and regional autonomy, of cultural diversity within political unity, established patterns that would characterize Scotland throughout its history. The development of a distinct Scottish identity emerged not from ethnic homogeneity, but from shared political experience and cultural exchange. Picts, Scots, Britons, Angles, and Norse had all contributed threads to the tapestry, creating a nation that was multicultural before the term existed. This diversity brought challenges, but also strengths, fostering a pragmatic flexibility that allowed Scotland to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining core institutions and values. The ability to absorb new influences without losing essential character would prove crucial in the struggles ahead. As the 11th century closed, Scotland stood at the threshold of new challenges and opportunities. The Norman conquest of England had brought a powerful and aggressive new neighbor to the southern border, one with administrative sophistication and military innovations that Scotland would need to match or counter. Yet the kingdom that had emerged from the fusion of ancient peoples possessed its own strengths, including a fierce tradition of independence, a balance between unity and regional autonomy, and a cultural resilience that could survive military defeat and political crisis. The birth of Scotland was not a single event, but a gradual process of amalgamation and transformation that created a nation capable of maintaining its independence and identity against considerable odds. The 12th century brought Scotland into closer contact with the transformative currents sweeping across medieval Europe. David, the first youngest son of Malcolm Canmore and St. Margaret, ascended to the throne in 1124 after years spent at the English court, where he had absorbed Norman administrative practices and witnessed firsthand the machinery of more centralized government. His reign would fundamentally reshape Scottish society, introducing feudalism, establishing burghs, and reorganizing the church along continental lines while somehow maintaining the essential independence that his predecessors had fought to preserve. David invited Norman knights northward, granting them lands in exchange for military service and administrative expertise. These newcomers brought castle-building techniques, heavy cavalry tactics, and legal concepts that would gradually merge with existing Celtic traditions. The Bruces, Stuarts, and Cummines, families whose names would echo through Scottish history, arrived during this period, establishing themselves through royal favor and strategic marriages with established Scottish noble houses. The introduction of feudalism was not a wholesale replacement of existing structures, but rather a layering of new systems over old. Highland chiefs maintained their traditional relationships with their clans, even as they swore feudal oaths to the crown. Lowland lords adopted Norman customs while preserving Scottish legal traditions. This hybrid system created a unique form of governance that combined personal loyalty, legal obligation, and customary practice in ways that sometimes complemented and sometimes contradicted each other. Royal burghs multiplied under David's patronage, receiving charters that granted exclusive trading rights within their regions. Berwick, Roxburgh, Edinburgh, and Stirling developed into significant commercial centers, attracting merchants from England, Flanders, and beyond. These towns operated under different laws than the surrounding countryside, creating pockets of commercial innovation and cultural exchange. Foreign merchants brought new goods, ideas, and techniques, while Scottish wool and hides found markets across Europe. The church underwent equally dramatic transformation. David established new bishoprics, founded monasteries, and endowed religious houses with vast estates. The Cistercians, Augustinians, and other continental orders introduced advanced agricultural techniques, transforming marginal lands into productive estates. These religious foundations became centers of learning, preserving not just theological texts, but also practical knowledge about medicine, engineering, and agriculture. The wealth they accumulated made them powerful economic actors, capable of financing construction projects and providing credit to nobles and merchants. Yet, beneath these modernizing changes, older patterns persisted. The lordship of the Isles maintained virtual independence in the Western Highlands and Hebrides, following Norse-influenced customs and maintaining their own diplomatic relationships with Ireland and Norway. The more mayors of ancient provinces retained significant autonomy, their power rooted in traditional loyalties that predated feudal arrangements. This multiplicity of authority sources would both strengthen and complicate Scottish governance for centuries. William the Lion, who succeeded his brother Malcolm IV in 1165, spent much of his long reign attempting to recover Northumberland, which Scottish kings had periodically controlled. His capture by English forces in 1174 led to the Treaty of Falaise, temporarily making Scotland a feudal dependency of England. Though this vassalage was later renounced, it established a dangerous precedent that English kings would repeatedly invoke to justify intervention in Scottish affairs. The reign of Alexander II, and especially Alexander III, represented a golden age of medieval Scottish sovereignty. Alexander III's rule from 1249 to 1286 saw Scotland prosperous, peaceful, and respected among European kingdoms. Trade flourished, law and order prevailed throughout most of the realm, and Scottish confidence grew. The acquisition of the Hebrides from Norway in 1266, following the Battle of Largs, brought the Western Islands firmly under Scottish control for the first time, completing the territorial consolidation of the kingdom. This prosperity rested on fragile foundations, became tragically apparent on a stormy March night in 1286. Alexander III, riding along the Fife coast to reach his new queen, fell from his horse and died, leaving only his infant granddaughter, Margaret, the Maid of Norway, as heir. The Scottish nobles, recognizing the dangers of a disputed succession, agreed to accept Margaret despite the unprecedented nature of female rule. Arrangements were made for her journey from Norway, including negotiations for her eventual marriage to Edward of Carnarvon, heir to the English throne. Margaret never reached her kingdom. She died in Orkney in 1290, possibly from seasickness or disease, leaving Scotland without a clear heir. Multiple claimants emerged, their genealogical arguments stretching back generations. John Balliol, Robert Bruce the Elder, and others pressed their cases, each backed by powerful factions. Unable to resolve the succession peacefully, the Scottish nobles made the fateful decision to invite Edward I of England to arbitrate between the claimants. Edward I, known as Longshanks and the Hammer of the Scots, saw opportunity in Scotland's crisis. He agreed to judge the succession, but demanded recognition as overlord of Scotland, forcing the claimants to acknowledge his superiority as a condition of participation. The great cause, as the succession dispute became known, proceeded with elaborate legal arguments, but the outcome was essentially predetermined. Edward selected John Balliol, correctly calculating that Balliol would prove more malleable than the proud Bruce family. Balliol's reign quickly demonstrated the impossible position of a Scottish king under English overlordship. Edward treated him as a subordinate, hearing appeals from Scottish courts, demanding military service for English wars, and generally undermining royal authority. When Balliol finally attempted to assert independence by allying with France in 1295, Edward invaded with overwhelming force. The Scottish army was crushed at Dunbar in 1296. Balliol was forced to abdicate, and Edward began direct rule over Scotland. The symbols of Scottish sovereignty were systematically removed. The Stone of Destiny upon which Scottish kings had been crowned for centuries, was carried to Westminster Abbey. The royal regalia disappeared into English hands. Scottish nobles were forced to sign the ragman roll, acknowledging Edward as their sovereign. Scotland appeared to have lost its independence, absorbed into the expanding Plantagenet Empire. Yet conquest proved easier than control. Within a year, resistance erupted across Scotland, led initially not by nobles, but by a minor knight named William Wallace. The son of a small landholder, Wallace emerged from obscurity to become the champion of Scottish independence. His victory at Stirling Bridge in 1297, where Scottish spearmen devastated a superior English force, electrified the nation and demonstrated that English military superiority was not absolute. Wallace's tactics revolutionized Scottish warfare. Stirling Bridge he used terrain and timing to neutralize English advantages in heavy cavalry and numbers. His soldiers, armed with long spears in compact formations called schiltrons, proved capable of defeating mounted knights when properly positioned. This military innovation would become central to Scottish tactics for generations, allowing armies of common soldiers to contest the battlefield with aristocratic cavalry. Following Stirling Bridge, Wallace invaded northern England, demonstrating that Scotland could threaten as well as defend. He assumed the title guardian of Scotland, ruling in the name of the absent Balliol. His administration, though brief, showed remarkable sophistication, maintaining diplomatic correspondence with European powers and attempting to restore normal governance despite ongoing war. Letters survive showing him negotiating trade agreements with German cities, evidence that even amid desperate struggle, Wallace understood the importance of economic relationships. Edward I returned from his French wars determined to crush Scottish resistance permanently. At Falkirk in 1298, he brought overwhelming force and new tactics, using Welsh longbowmen to break up the Scottish schiltrons before sending in cavalry. Wallace's army was destroyed, and though he escaped, his guardianship ended. He spent years seeking support from France, Norway, and the Pope, but was eventually captured through betrayal and executed in London in 1305 with savage brutality. Wallace's death did not end resistance, but transformed it. Robert Bruce, grandson of the earlier claimant, had played an ambiguous role during Wallace's rising, sometimes supporting, sometimes opposing the rebellion as political advantage dictated. In 1306, he made his decisive move, murdering John Comyn, his chief rival for the throne, in a church at Dumfries. Days later, he had himself crowned King of Scots at Scone, though without the traditional stone or regalia. Bruce's early reign brought disaster after disaster. Defeated at Methven and Dalry, his supporters scattered, his family captured, his brothers executed. Bruce himself became a fugitive, hiding in the remote western highlands and islands. Legend speaks of him watching a spider repeatedly trying to spin its web, drawing inspiration from its persistence. Whether true or not, the story captures something essential about Bruce's character, its ability to endure failure and continue struggling against seemingly hopeless odds. The tide began turning through guerrilla warfare and gradual accumulation of support. Bruce avoided pitched battles, instead capturing castles through surprise and subterfuge, then destroying them to prevent English reoccupation. He built a network of committed supporters, some great nobles, but many minor landholders and common people who saw in him the possibility of restored independence. His lieutenant James Douglas became legendary for his daring raids into English-held territory, earning the nickname Black Douglas from terrified enemies. Edward I died in 1307 while preparing another invasion, and his son Edward II lacked his father's military genius and determination. Bruce exploited this weakness, gradually extending his control throughout Scotland. By 1314, Stirling Castle, the last major English stronghold, was under siege. Edward II assembled one of the largest armies ever to invade Scotland, determined to relieve Stirling and crush Bruce permanently. The armies met at Bannockburn on June 23rd to 24th, 1314. Bruce chose his ground carefully, using the marshy terrain to funnel the English advance and neutralize their numerical advantage. The battle began with single combat between Bruce and Henry de Bohun, an English knight who charged the Scottish king. Bruce, mounted on a small horse, dodged the lance and split de Bohun's skull with his battle-axe, an act that electrified the Scottish army. The main battle saw Scottish schiltrons, perfected since Wallace's time, advance aggressively rather than merely defending. The English cavalry, compressed in marshy ground, could not effectively charge. Their archers, poorly positioned, fell victim to a Scottish cavalry charge. As English cohesion collapsed, what began as tactical withdrawal became complete rout. Edward II barely escaped, abandoning royal treasure and prestige on the battlefield. Bannockburn did not immediately end the war, but it fundamentally changed its character. Bruce was now unquestionably king, his position secured by military victory. He could take the offensive, raiding deep into England, threatening to support rebellions in Ireland and Wales. The English were reduced to defending their own territory rather than attempting to conquer Scotland. Years of negotiation, papal intervention, continued warfare followed before the Treaty of Edinburgh and Northampton in 1328 finally recognized Scottish independence. Robert Bruce, by then gravely ill, had achieved what seemed impossible, restoring Scottish sovereignty against a neighbor many times more powerful. The treaty acknowledged him as King of Scots, renounced all English claims to overlordship, and agreed to a marriage between Bruce's son, David, and Edward III's sister Joan. The Wars of Independence transformed Scotland profoundly. Military innovations, particularly the effective use of common soldiers in schiltron formations, had social implications beyond the battlefield, demonstrating that aristocratic dominance could be challenged. The shared struggle for independence created a stronger sense of national identity, uniting Highlanders and Lowlanders, Gaelic speakers and English speakers, in common cause. The conflict also produced founding myths and heroes that would inspire future generations. Wallace, the martyred champion of freedom; Bruce, the persistent king who never gave up; Douglas, the bold warrior. These figures entered Scottish consciousness as exemplars of resistance and determination. Their stories, embellished and romanticized over centuries, provided templates for Scottish identity that emphasized independence, resilience, and defiance of overwhelming odds. The institutional changes were equally significant. The war had demonstrated the importance of naval power, leading to development of Scottish maritime capabilities. The need for diplomatic support encouraged stronger ties with continental Europe, particularly France. The Scottish Church, which had strongly supported independence, gained recognition from the Pope as a special daughter of Rome, answerable directly to the papacy, rather than through English ecclesiastical hierarchy. The Declaration of Arbroath, sent to the Pope in 1320, articulated concepts of popular sovereignty and conditional monarchy that were remarkably advanced for their time. Robert Bruce's death in 1329 left Scotland independent but vulnerable, with a 5-year-old king, David II, inheriting a crown that many still contested. The peace so dearly won proved fragile as Edward Balliol, son of the deposed King John, returned with English backing to claim his father's throne. The Second War of Independence erupted almost immediately, demonstrating that Scotland's sovereignty would require constant vigilance to maintain. Young David and his mother fled to France, while Scottish nobles, divided between Bruce loyalists and Balliol supporters, replayed the chaos that had preceded the First War. The disinherited, as Balliol's supporters were known, had lost their Scottish lands for opposing Bruce and now sought restoration through English arms. Their victory at Dublin Moor in 1332 showed that Scottish military superiority was not guaranteed, especially when faction fought faction. Edward III of England, young and ambitious, saw opportunity to succeed where his father had failed. He besieged Berwick, forcing the Scots to attack him at Culloden Hill in 1333, where English longbows devastated the advancing schiltrons. revealing the tactical limitations that would plague Scottish armies for centuries. Yet Scotland possessed a resilience that transcended battlefield defeats. While Baliol nominally ruled with English support, his authority never extended far beyond English garrison towns. Scottish resistance continued in the forests and hills, led by men like Andrew Mary and later Robert the Steward, maintaining the continuity of legitimate government even in exile. The French alliance proved its worth as France's wars with England prevented sustained English pressure on Scotland, demonstrating how European politics could protect Scottish independence when military might alone could not. David II returned from French exile in 1341, nearly adult and ready to reclaim his kingdom. His reign would prove tumultuous, marked by military disaster at Neville's Cross in 1346, where he was captured, attempting to invade England in support of France. 11 years of English captivity followed, during which Scotland was governed by Robert the Steward as guardian. The enormous ransom demanded for David's release, 100,000 marks, would burden Scotland for generations, requiring new forms of taxation and fundamentally altering the relationship between Crown and Parliament. Parliament's evolution accelerated during this period as the need for ransom payments required broader consent for taxation. The three estates, clergy, nobility, and burgesses, met more frequently and began asserting greater control over royal finances. This was not democracy in any modern sense, but it established principles of consultation and consent that limited arbitrary royal power. The burghs, growing in wealth and confidence, gained a permanent voice in national governance, their merchant interests increasingly shaping policy. David II died childless in 1371, bringing the Bruce line to an end and elevating Robert the Steward to the throne as Robert II, founding the Stuart dynasty that would rule Scotland for over 3 centuries. The Stuarts inherited a kingdom exhausted by war and ransom payments, but also one with established institutions, recognized borders, and a strong sense of national identity. Their challenge would be transforming this war-hardened nation into a prosperous European kingdom while managing powerful nobles who had grown accustomed to independence during the long struggles. Connor II's reign revealed the fundamental weakness that would plague early Stuart kings: their lack of resources compared to mighty subjects. Great magnates like the Douglas family controlled vast territories and maintained private armies larger than royal forces. The Highland lords operated with near-complete autonomy, their Gaelic culture and clan loyalties existing outside the feudal framework that theoretically governed the realm. The crown had to rule through negotiation and balance rather than command, creating a political culture of complex alliances and sudden reversals. The development of Scots law during this period blended multiple traditions into a distinctive system: Celtic customs, feudal principles, canon law, and Roman legal concepts merged in ways unique to Scotland. The establishment of the Court of Session as a permanent judicial body professionalized justice, while local sheriff courts and baron courts maintained older forms of dispute resolution. Legal education began developing, with Scottish students traveling to continental universities and returning with sophisticated understanding of jurisprudence. Robert III, plagued by physical disability from a horse kick and psychological wounds from his harsh father, proved unable to control the kingdom's violent nobility. His reign witnessed the darkest episodes of Scottish feudal anarchy, including the infamous clan battle at Perth in 1396, where 2 Highland clans settled their dispute through a formal combat to the death before the king and court. 30 champions on each side, fighting until only one clan remained standing. His brother, the Duke of Albany, effectively ruled while Robert retreated into depression and self-doubt. The fate of Robert III's eldest son, David, Duke of Rothesay, illustrated the brutal politics of the era. Starved to death in Falkland Palace on Albany's orders in 1402, his murder demonstrated that even royal blood offered little protection from ambition. Robert III, fearing for his youngest son, James, sent the boy to France for safety in 1406. English pirates captured the ship, and James spent 18 years as an English prisoner, during which time Robert III died, allegedly of grief, leaving Scotland under Albany's regency. James returned to Scotland in 1424, educated, angry, and determined to establish royal authority. His English captivity had been comfortable, even luxurious, providing him with the finest education available. He had observed English administration, studied literature and music, and developed ideas about kingship far removed from the violent feudalism of his homeland. His poem, King Esquire, revealed a sophisticated mind capable of expressing complex emotions through carefully crafted verse. The returning king moved against the Albany stewards with ruthless efficiency, executing the entire male line and confiscating their vast estates. He challenged Highland autonomy, imprisoning chiefs who attended a parliament in Inverness. His reforms of law, administration, and finance showed vision and energy, but his methods created dangerous resentments. The nobility, accustomed to weak kings, found themselves confronted by a monarch who intended to rule rather than reign. James I's assassination in Perth in 1437, stabbed to death in a sewer where he had hidden from conspirators, demonstrated the limits of royal power when exercised against entrenched interests. Yet his reign had changed expectations about kingship. Future Stuart monarchs would inherit his vision of centralized authority, even if they lacked means to fully implement it. The tension between royal ambition and noble resistance would define Scottish politics for generations. James II, another child king, grew to manhood amid the violent struggle between the crown and the Douglas family. The Black Douglases had accumulated power that rivaled royalty itself, sculling much of southern Scotland and maintaining independent diplomatic relations with England. James II's personal murder of the 8th Earl of Douglas at Stirling Castle in 1452, stabbing him during a supposedly safe conduct meeting, showed that Stuart kings could match noble brutality when necessary. The subsequent civil war saw the final destruction of Black Douglas power, their castles demolished, their lands distributed to loyal supporters. James II's victory established that no subject, however mighty, could challenge royal authority with impunity. His death in 1460, killed by an exploding cannon while besieging Roxborough, ended a reign that had significantly strengthened monarchical power despite its violent methods. Cultural flowering accompanied political consolidation. The 15th century witnessed the emergence of distinctive Scottish literature, with poets like Robert Henryson, William Dunbar, and later Gavin Douglas creating works that rivaled anything produced in England. Writing in Scots, the language descended from Northern English but developed into its own sophisticated medium. These makers, as poets were called, explored themes ranging from moral allegory to bawdy humor, from courtly romance to savage political satire. The Scottish universities, St. Andrews, founded in 1413, Glasgow in 1451, and Aberdeen in 1495, provided indigenous education that reduced dependence on foreign institutions. These foundations fostered intellectual life that extended beyond theology to embrace law, medicine, and the liberal arts. Students no longer needed to travel to Paris or Bologna for advanced education, though many still did, bringing back continental ideas that enriched Scottish thought. Architecture evolved from purely military fortification toward structures that combined defense with comfort and display. Tower houses proliferated across the landscape, their vertical emphasis reflecting both limited ground space and defensive needs. Great castles like Stirling and Edinburgh were transformed from stark fortresses into palace complexes suitable for Renaissance courts. Churches and abbeys, recovering from war damage, were rebuilt with increasing elaboration, their decoration revealing growing prosperity and artistic ambition. James III's reign brought new challenges as royal authority confronted economic change and political innovation. His preference for low-born advisors over traditional nobility created resentment that exploded into open rebellion. The king's interests in art, architecture, and alchemy rather than warfare and hunting alienated martial nobles who expected more conventional royal behavior. His mysterious death after the Battle of Sochorborn in 1488, possibly murdered while fleeing the field, ended an intellectually curious but politically maladroit reign. James IV ascended amid regicide guilt, wearing an iron chain around his waist as perpetual penance for his role in his father's death. Yet he proved Scotland's most successful Renaissance monarch, combining military prowess with cultural sophistication, diplomatic skill with administrative reform. His court became a center of European culture, attracting scholars, poets, and musicians. He spoke multiple languages, patronized printing, sponsored expeditions, and corresponded with major European intellectuals. Education flourished under James IV's patronage. The Education Act of 1496 required landowners to educate their eldest sons, creating a literate governing class. This was revolutionary legislation, recognizing that effective governance required educated administrators. The Act's implementation varied. Deet's principle that education mattered for secular as well as religious purposes marked a fundamental shift in Scottish society. The king's marriage to Margaret Tudor in 1503, the union of the thistle and the rose, created dynastic ties between Scotland and England that would eventually unite the crowns. The Treaty of Perpetual Peace that accompanied the marriage promised to end centuries of warfare. Yet European politics made such peace impossible to maintain. When Henry VIII invaded France, Scotland's ancient alliance obligations activated, drawing James IV to thwart the catastrophe that would end his reign and traumatize Scottish memory. The navy James IV created represented Scotland's maritime ambitions. The Great Michael, launched in 1511, was possibly the largest warship of its time, statement of Scottish power and technological capability. Its construction required timber from across Scotland and Scandinavia, demonstrating the resources a determined monarch could mobilize. The ship symbolized Scotland's aspirations to be more than England's poor northern neighbor, to be a significant European power with global reach. Trade expanded dramatically during this period. Scottish merchants ventured to the Baltic, the Low Countries, France, and even the Mediterranean. Wool remained the primary export, but hides, fish, and increasingly manufactured goods joined the cargo manifests. The Burghs developed sophisticated commercial practices, establishing trading partnerships, credit arrangements, quality controls that integrated Scotland into European economic networks. The Lordship of the Isles, that semi-independent Gaelic principality, finally fell to royal authority in 1493. James IV's suppression of the MacDonald lords brought the Hebrides, K, under direct crown control for the first time since their acquisition from Norway. This integration remained incomplete, with clan loyalties and Gaelic culture persisting, but it marked a significant expansion of effective royal authority. By 1513, Scotland appeared to have achieved remarkable success. The kingdom was prosperous, cultured, and respected. Its independence was secure, its institutions established, its culture flourishing. James IV stood at the height of his powers, commanding a modernizing nation that seemed poised to play an increasingly important role in European affairs. The Renaissance had truly arrived in Scotland, bringing new ideas about art, governance, and human potential. Scottish scholars participated in European intellectual networks, while merchants traded in markets from Krakow to Cadiz. The Stuart dynasty had overcome its turbulent beginnings to establish a stable, increasingly sophisticated rule. The transformation from the war-torn nation that Robert Bruce had left to the confident kingdom of James IV represented one of medieval Europe's most remarkable success stories. Yet, this golden moment balanced on foundations more fragile than contemporaries recognized. Catastrophe that awaited at Flodden Field, which shattered these bright prospects, but the foundations laid by the early Stuart kings would endure, supporting Scottish identity through centuries of trial. The splendor of the Scottish Renaissance. with all its poetry and pageantry, came to a sudden and devastating end on a September afternoon in 1513. King James IV, who had transformed Scotland into a cultured and confident nation, led his army south across the border into England. He had answered a call from France, Scotland's old ally, to create a diversion while the English King Henry VIII campaigned on the continent. It was a decision that would haunt Scotland for generations to come. The Scottish host gathered at Flodden Edge in Northumberland, one of the largest armies the nation had ever assembled. Estimates suggest that between 20 and 30,000 men stood ready beneath the royal banner. They carried with them the finest artillery in Europe, the pride of James's military modernization. The king himself wore armor of exceptional craftsmanship, a symbol of the Renaissance prince he had become. On the 9th of September, the Earl of Surrey's English forces approached through rain and mist. The Scots held the high ground, a seemingly impregnable position on Brankston Hill. James had every advantage that terrain could offer, yet something compelled him to abandon it. Perhaps it was the chivalric code he had absorbed from French romances, or perhaps he could not bear to appear a coward before his men. Whatever the reason, he ordered his army to descend and meet the English on level ground. The battle that followed became the bloodiest in Scottish history. The long Scottish pikes, so effective on open terrain, proved useless in the close, muddy combat that developed. English bills, shorter weapons with curved blades, hacked through the pike shafts and cut down the Scottish nobility wholesale. James himself fought on foot among his men, advancing so far into the English lines that he came within a spear's length of Surrey himself. When darkness fell over Flodden Field, the flower of Scottish manhood lay dead in the mud. King James IV perished there, his body found the next morning surrounded by his household knights. With him died 12 earls, 14 lords, an archbishop, 2 bishops, and countless chieftains. The universities lost their brightest scholars, the churches their finest clergy, the great families their heirs. Scotland had suffered wounds that would take decades to heal. The news reached Edinburgh before the survivors did. Church bells tolled throughout the night as families learned of their losses. The city walls, hastily reinforced in the days that followed, became a symbol of the fear that gripped the nation. The crown passed to an infant, James V, just 17 months old. Scotland entered another period of minority rule, with all the faction and intrigue that such periods invited. The Regency years saw Scotland torn between competing noble families, each seeking to control the young king and the wealth that proximity to power brought. Margaret Tudor, the Queen Mother and sister of Henry VIII, attempted to hold the realm together. Her remarriage to the Earl of Angus further complicated an already tangled political situation. A country drifted, its attention consumed by internal struggles, while the larger world transformed around it. Those transformations touched Scotland most profoundly in matters of faith. Across the narrow seas, Martin Luther had nailed his theses to a church door and shattered the religious unity of Western Christendom. His ideas spread rapidly through the trading networks that connected Scotland to the Baltic and the Low Countries. Merchants returning from Danzig and Antwerp carried Lutheran pamphlets alongside their cargoes of timber and cloth. The old church in Scotland was vulnerable to such challenges. Its wealth had become a source of scandal, with bishops living like princes, while parish priests struggled in poverty. Many offices had become the property of noble families, passed down like any other inheritance, regardless of spiritual calling. The gap between the church's teachings and the lives of its leaders created fertile ground for reform movements to take root. James V came of age in this atmosphere of religious ferment and took personal control of his kingdom in 1528. He proved himself a capable ruler, restoring order after the chaos of the Regency years and asserting royal authority over rebellious nobles. His numerous illegitimate children testified to a life lived with considerable passions. His two French marriages aligned Scotland firmly with the Catholic powers of Europe against the Protestant tide. The king's relationship with the church was complex and contradictory. He defended the old faith against heresy, burning Lutheran preachers and confiscating the lands of those who fled abroad. Yet, he also exploited the church's wealth ruthlessly, extracting enormous sums from the clergy to fund his building projects and maintain his court. The great palaces of Falkland and Stirling rose during his reign, monuments to royal ambition built partly with ecclesiastical gold. James V's final years brought conflict with his uncle Henry VIII, who had broken with Rome and established himself as head of the English Church. Henry demanded that Scotland follow England's path into Protestantism. James refused, remaining loyal to the old faith and to the French alliance. The inevitable war followed, and once again, a Scottish king marched his army south to meet the English. The battle at Solway Moss in 1542 proved another catastrophe for Scottish arms. Though the losses were smaller than Flodden, the humiliation was perhaps greater. The Scottish army dissolved into panic and confusion, surrendering in droves to a much smaller English force. James V, already ill, received news of the defeat on his deathbed and told that his wife had given birth to a daughter. He supposedly murmured that the Stuart dynasty had come with the lass and would go with the lass. He died 6 days later, leaving the crown to an infant girl just 1 week old. Mary Stuart entered a world that seemed determined to destroy her. The kings of England and France immediately began plotting to control her through marriage, seeing in the infant queen a prize that could reshape the map of Britain. Henry VIII's rough wooing, as the English invasions of the 1540s became known, devastated the Scottish lowlands in an attempt to force a marriage between Mary and his son Edward. Towns burned, abbeys fell, and the beautiful borders landscape was scarred by war. The Scots responded by sending their young queen to France, where she would be raised at the most sophisticated court in Europe. Mary grew into a tall, striking woman, accomplished in languages, music, and poetry. She married the French heir and briefly became Queen of France before her husband's early death left her a widow at 18. In 1561, she returned to Scotland, utterly transformed by her absence. While Mary danced at French masques and learned the intricacies of continental politics, Scotland had undergone a religious revolution. The transformation owed much to John Knox, a man whose thundering voice and uncompromising vision would shape Scottish Christianity for centuries. Knox had spent years in exile, absorbing the teachings of Calvin in Geneva and developing a theology that placed scripture above tradition and conscience above hierarchy. Knox returned to Scotland in 1559 and immediately began preaching against what he called the idolatry of the Mass. His sermons ignited riots in Perth, where mobs stripped churches of their Catholic furnishings and destroyed monasteries that had stood for centuries. The violence spread rapidly, fueled by resentment against French influence and genuine religious conviction. By the time Mary landed at Leith, Scotland had officially adopted Protestantism and abolished papal authority. The confrontation between Mary and Knox became one of history's great dramatic encounters. She represented everything he opposed, a Catholic queen trained in French ways, beautiful and charming where he valued severity and truth. Their debates at Holyrood Palace saw the queen reduced to tears by the preacher's refusal to moderate his attacks on her faith. Yet Mary showed courage in these exchanges, defending her right to private worship with intelligence and dignity. Mary's personal reign lasted only 6 years, but those years packed enough drama for several lifetimes. Her marriage to her cousin, Lord Darnley, a vain and violent young man, produced an heir but descended quickly into mutual hatred. The murder of her Italian secretary, David Riccio, stabbed dozens of times in her presence while she was pregnant, revealed the depths of Darnley's jealousy and the dangers surrounding her. The subsequent explosion at Kirkfield that killed Darnley himself implicated Mary in a scandal from which her reputation never recovered. The Queen's hasty marriage to the Earl of Bothwell, widely suspected of arranging Darnley's murder, proved her undoing. The Scottish nobility rose against her, defeating her forces at Carberry Hill and imprisoning her in Lochleven Castle. There she was forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son, James, just 13 months old. Scotland had its fourth consecutive minority ruler, continuing a pattern that had defined the 16th century. Mary's escape from Lochleven and her subsequent defeat at Langside sent her fleeing across the border into England, seeking help from her cousin Elizabeth. She would spend the next 19 years as Elizabeth's prisoner, the focus of Catholic plots and the source of endless diplomatic complications. Her execution in 1587 removed a threat that had haunted Elizabeth's reign, but it also created a martyr whose memory would inspire generations of Catholic resistance. Meanwhile, in Scotland, the young James VI grew up under the tutelage of George Buchanan, one of the finest scholars in Europe and a man of uncompromising Protestant convictions. Buchanan believed that kings ruled by the consent of the people and could be lawfully resisted if they became tyrants. He beat these principles into his royal pupil with a severity that bordered on abuse. James emerged from this education with a deep knowledge of Scripture, an excellent command of Latin, and a passionate hatred of Presbyterian claims to authority over monarchs. The personal rule of James VI began in 1585 and marked a new era in Scottish history. Unlike his predecessors, James would reign long enough to leave a lasting stamp on his kingdom. He proved a skilled political operator, managing the competing factions of nobles and churchmen with a combination of cunning and compromise. His famous saying that he ruled with his pen rather than his sword captured his preference for diplomacy over confrontation. James's relationship with the Kirk, as the Scottish Church became known, defined much of his reign. He fought a long battle against Presbyterian ministers who claimed that kings were mere members of the congregation, subject to church discipline like any other sinner. James countered with his theory of divine right, arguing that monarchs answered only to God. This theological conflict would shape British politics for the next century and beyond. The king's marriage to Anne of Denmark in 1589 added a new dimension to Scottish court life. Anne brought Lutheran influences and a love of theatrical entertainment that brightened the somewhat dour atmosphere of the Reformed kingdom. The couple produced children, securing the succession that had been Scotland's constant worry. Prince Henry became the hope of Protestant Europe, while the younger Charles grew up in his brother's shadow. As Elizabeth of England aged without an heir, attention increasingly focused on James as her most likely successor. His descent from Margaret Tudor, who had married James IV after Flodden, gave him the strongest hereditary claim to the English throne. James cultivated English contacts carefully, positioning himself as a moderate Protestant who could unite the warring religious factions that divided England. His patience and careful diplomacy paid their ultimate reward in 1603. The news of Elizabeth's death reached Edinburgh in the early hours of March 27th. James had waited for this moment his entire life, and he wasted no time in claiming his inheritance. Within days, he had set out for London, beginning a journey that would transform both his own life and the history of the British Isles. The King of Scots had become the King of England, uniting the two crowns that had warred against each other for centuries. The departure of the court to London marked a turning point that Scots at the time barely understood. James promised to return every 3 years, but he came back only once, 1617. Scotland had lost its king to a larger, wealthier, more powerful kingdom to the south. The nation that had fought so hard to maintain its independence now found itself bound to England by ties of monarchy. That would prove impossible to break. The union of crowns had begun, and Scotland's future would forever be intertwined with that of its ancient enemy. The road to London stretched before James Stuart like a triumphal procession. Yet, behind him, Scotland entered an uncertain twilight. The kingdom that had defined itself through centuries of resistance to English Domination now shared a monarch with its ancient enemy. James governed his northern realm from afar, issuing decrees and receiving petitions through a privy council that met in Edinburgh, while the king held court a month's journey to the south. The absent king proved surprisingly effective at managing Scottish affairs through correspondence and carefully chosen officials. James understood his native land in ways his successors never would, knowing which nobles to flatter and which to threaten, which ministers to promote and which to sideline. He continued his campaign to bring the kirk under royal control, reintroducing bishops as moderators of the church assemblies and asserting the crown's authority over ecclesiastical appointments. These changes troubled many Scots who believed that Presbyterianism meant government by assemblies of ministers and elders, not by bishops appointed from above. The kirk had developed its own traditions during the decades since the Reformation, traditions that emphasized the equality of ministers and the independence of church courts from royal interference. James walked a careful line, pushing his reforms gradually and avoiding the direct confrontations that might spark open resistance. His son Charles I possessed none of this subtlety. The new king, who came to the throne in 1625, had been raised entirely in England and New Scotland, only from books and reports. He believed in the divine right of kings with a fervor that exceeded even his father's convictions, where James had maneuvered and compromised. Charles demanded and expected obedience. This fundamental misunderstanding of Scottish character would bring catastrophe upon both king and kingdom. Charles waited 8 years before visiting Scotland for his coronation, a delay that offended Scottish pride and suggested where his priorities lay. When he finally arrived in 1633, he brought with him plans to reshape the Scottish Church according to English patterns. He sought to impose a new prayer book, new vestments, new ceremonies, and a new hierarchy that would bring Scottish worship into conformity with the Church of England. Two Presbyterian sensibilities. These innovations smelled of popery. The explosion came on a July Sunday in 1637 when the new prayer book was read for the first time in St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh. According to legend, a woman named Jenny Geddes hurled her folding stool at the dean's head, crying out against the popish liturgy. Whether or not this particular detail is true, the riot that followed was real enough. The congregation erupted in fury, driving the bishop from the church and sparking demonstrations that spread throughout the city. The protests grew into something far more organized and dangerous than a mere riot. Scottish nobles, ministers, and burgesses came together to draft a document that would define their resistance to royal policy. They called it the National Covenant, and it bound its signers to defend the true Reformed religion against all innovations. Copies circulated throughout the lowlands in February 1638, gathering signatures in churchyards and market squares. Men wept as they signed, believing they were pledging their lives to God's cause. The covenant was a revolutionary document wrapped in conservative language. Its signers claimed they sought only to preserve the religion established by law, not to challenge the king's authority in civil matters. Yet the logic of their position led inexorably toward confrontation. If the king commanded what God forbade, then the godly must resist. This principle, once admitted, could justify rebellion against any royal policy that conflicted with Presbyterian conscience. Charles responded to the covenant with characteristic inflexibility, demanding that Scotland submit to his religious program without conditions. The Covenanters prepared for war, raising armies and fortifying towns throughout the lowlands. The Bishops' Wars of 1639 and 1640 revealed the military weakness of the king's position. Scottish forces crossed the border, occupied Newcastle, and demanded payment for their expenses. Charles, humiliated and desperate for funds, was forced to summon the English Parliament that would eventually destroy him. The events that followed entangled Scotland in the broader crisis of the Three Kingdoms. When civil war erupted in England between king and parliament, the Scots initially stood aside, watching their neighbors tear themselves apart. But both sides sought Scottish support, and the Covenanters drove a hard bargain. In exchange for military intervention against the Royalists, the English Parliament agreed to impose Presbyterianism throughout Britain. The Solemn League and Covenant of 1643 seemed to promise that Scotland's religious vision would triumph across the island. Scottish armies marched into England and fought alongside parliamentary forces at Marston Moor, helping to break the military power of the Royalist cause. Yet, the alliance proved troubled from the start. The English showed little enthusiasm for Presbyterian church government, and a new force was rising within the parliamentary armies. The soldiers who followed Oliver Cromwell cared nothing for bishops or assemblies, but sought liberty for each congregation to worship as it chose. This independency horrified Scottish Presbyterians as much as any popish innovation. The execution of Charles I in January 1649 shocked Scotland profoundly. However much the Covenanters had resisted the king's policies, they had never questioned his right to rule. Monarchy was ordained by God, and to execute an anointed sovereign was an act of sacrilege that cried out for divine vengeance. The Scottish Parliament immediately proclaimed Charles II as king, demanding only that he subscribe to the covenant and commit himself to Presbyterian government. The young Charles II proved willing to sign anything that might restore him to his thrones. He came to Scotland in 1650, endured endless sermons and public humiliations, and watched as the Kirk purged his army of anyone suspected of insufficient godliness. This weakened force met Cromwell's veterans at Dunbar and suffered a devastating defeat. The following year, Charles led a Scottish invasion of England that ended in disaster at Worcester. The king fled into exile, and Scotland lay open to conquest. Cromwell's occupation of Scotland lasted nearly a decade and left deep scars on the national memory. English garrisons controlled the major towns, and a military government ruled with little regard for Scottish traditions or institutions. The occupation brought certain benefits, including religious toleration for Protestant dissenters and access to English markets. But it also brought heavy taxation, cultural humiliation, and the suppression of the institutions that had defined Scottish identity. The restoration of Charles II in 1660 brought joy throughout Scotland, as people celebrated the return of their native dynasty and the end of English military rule. Yet the restored king harbored bitter memories of his Scottish sojourn, of the lectures and humiliations he had endured at Covenanting hands. He showed no gratitude to those who had crowned him and fought for him. Instead, he set about dismantling everything the Covenanters had built. Bishops returned to Scotland, and the Presbyterian system of church government was swept away. Ministers who refused to accept the new order were ejected from their parishes, forced to choose between their consciences and their livelihoods. Hundreds chose conscience, and their congregations followed them into the hills and moors, where they held illegal worship services known as conventicles. The government responded with increasingly severe measures, dispatching soldiers to hunt down these gatherings and punish those who attended them. The years that followed became known as the Killing Time, a period of persecution that seared itself into Scottish Protestant memory. Covenanters were shot on the hillsides, drowned in the rivers, and hanged at crossroads throughout the Southwest. Women suffered alongside men, their gender offering no protection against a government determined to crush religious dissent. The graves of the martyrs became sacred sites, tended by later generations who saw in their sacrifice a testimony to the faith. The persecution reached its height under James VII, who came to the throne in 1685. Unlike his brother, James was openly Catholic and made no secret of his desire to restore the old faith throughout his kingdoms. His policies united Protestant Scotland against him, and when William of Orange invaded England in 1688, the Scottish Parliament quickly declared James to have forfeited the crown. The Glorious Revolution, as it became known, established Protestant succession and constitutional limits on royal power. William and Mary accepted the Scottish crown on terms that restored Presbyterianism and acknowledged Parliament's role in government. T's settlement of 1690 gave Scotland the church government for which the Covenanters had fought and died, though without the ambition to impose that system on England. The Kirk emerged from persecution with its identity strengthened, convinced that suffering had purified the faithful and vindicated their cause. Yet, the Revolution settlement left deep tensions unresolved. Many in the Highlands remained loyal to the exiled Stuarts, seeing in James and his heirs the rightful kings of Scotland. This Jacobite sentiment, as it came to be called, would trouble the new regime for decades. The massacre at Glencoe in 1692, when government soldiers slaughtered members of Clan MacDonald for their tardiness in swearing loyalty to William, became a symbol of Highland grievance against a lowland establishment. The final years of the 17th century brought economic catastrophe that would reshape Scotland's political future. The nation remained poor compared to its neighbors, lacking the colonial trade that enriched England and Holland. Scottish merchants dreamed of establishing their own trading empire, a way to bypass English restrictions and claim a share of the wealth flowing from the Americas and the East. This dream took concrete form in the Company of Scotland, chartered in 1695 to trade with Africa and the Indies. The company's directors settled on an ambitious scheme to establish a colony at Darien on the Isthmus of Panama. This narrow strip of land offered the possibility of controlling trade between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. If successful, the colony would make Scotland a major commercial power overnight. The Darien scheme attracted investment from throughout Scottish society. Nobles and merchants, ministers and widows poured their savings into the company, eventually committing perhaps half of all the liquid capital in Scotland. The first expedition sailed in 1698, carrying 1,200 colonists to establish New Edinburgh on the pestilential shores of the Caribbean coast. They found not the paradise promised by the company's promoters, but a hellish swamp of disease and Spanish hostility. The colony failed catastrophically. Fever killed the settlers faster than ships could bring replacements. The Spanish, who claimed the territory, besieged the settlement and cut off supplies. England, eager to preserve its alliance with Spain, forbade its Caribbean colonies to provide any assistance to the struggling Scots. By 1700, Darien had been abandoned and thousands of Scottish lives and fortunes had been lost in the jungle. The aftermath of Darien created a crisis that threatened the very existence of the Scottish state. The nation was bankrupt, its people impoverished, its dreams of commercial greatness shattered. Many blamed England for the disaster, seeing in William's hostility a deliberate attempt to keep Scotland weak and dependent. The English Parliament, for its part, grew alarmed at the possibility that Scotland might choose a different monarch when Queen Anne died, creating a hostile kingdom on England's northern border. Both nations began to consider possibilities that would have seemed unthinkable a generation earlier. The failures of the 17th century, the wars and persecutions and economic disasters, had exhausted Scotland's capacity to stand alone. England's security demanded that it could not have an independent and potentially hostile neighbor sharing the same island. The stage was set for negotiations that would end Scotland's existence as an independent kingdom and create something new from the wreckage of the old. The negotiations began in earnest in 1706, conducted by commissioners appointed by both the Scottish and English parliaments. They met in London, working through the details of a treaty that would dissolve the ancient kingdoms and create a single state called Great Britain. The Scottish commissioners knew they were bargaining from weakness, our nation's economy shattered and their political options limited. Yet, they extracted terms that preserved much of what Scotland held dear. The Treaty of Union that emerged from these discussions contained 25 articles covering everything from trade to taxation, from representation to religion. Scotland was sent 45 members to the House of Commons and 16 elected peers. to the House of Lords, a proportion far smaller than its population warranted, but sufficient to give it a voice in British affairs. Scottish merchants would gain access to English colonial markets, the prize that Darien had failed to deliver. The Presbyterian Church would be guaranteed its independence, protected by a separate act that formed part of the constitutional settlement. The debates in the Scottish Parliament proved fierce and bitter. Opponents of the treaty argued that Scotland was selling its birthright for English gold, surrendering the independence that generations had fought and died to preserve. The Duke of Hamilton led the opposition, though his commitment wavered at crucial moments. Pamphlets circulated throughout Edinburgh warning of the consequences of union. Crowds gathered outside Parliament Hall to protest against the commissioners who had negotiated away their nation. Those who favored union argued that Scotland had no realistic alternative. The nation could not survive economically in isolation, cut off from English markets and colonial trade. An independent Scotland might choose a different monarch from England, but this would only invite invasion and conquest. Better to join willingly on negotiated terms than to be absorbed by force after another disastrous war. The equivalent, a payment of nearly £400,000 to compensate Scottish investors in the Darien Company, sweetened the bitter pill of union. The treaty passed the Scottish Parliament in January 1707, approved by a majority that included many who had been bought with English bribes and promises of patronage. The final session met on March 25th, and the ancient Parliament that had governed Scotland since the Middle Ages dissolved itself forever. The Lord Chancellor, touching the treaty with the royal scepter, reportedly remarked that there was an end to an old song. Church bells rang throughout Edinburgh, though whether in celebration or mourning remained unclear. The early years of union brought little of the prosperity that its advocates had promised. Scottish trade actually declined in the immediate aftermath, as merchants struggled to adapt to new regulations and English competitors. The imposition of English taxes, particularly on malt, provoked riots in Glasgow and elsewhere. Many Scots felt they had been cheated, their parliament dissolved, and their identity erased in exchange for benefits that failed to materialize. This discontent fueled support for the exiled Stuart dynasty, which had never accepted the loss of its thrones. James Francis Edward Stuart, the son of James VII, maintained a court in exile and waited for an opportunity to reclaim his inheritance. That opportunity seemed to arrive in 1715, when the death of Queen Anne brought a German prince to the British throne. George, I spoke no English and showed little understanding of his new kingdoms. Jacobite hopes soared. The Earl of Mar raised the Stuart standard at Braemar in September 1715, proclaiming James VIII as the rightful king of Scotland. Highland clans rallied to the cause, joined by lowland nobles who resented the Union settlement and its disruption of their traditional influence. The Jacobite army swelled to perhaps 12,000 men, more than enough to challenge the small government forces in Scotland. Yet, Mar proved an indecisive commander, squandering his numerical advantage through hesitation and poor strategy. The Battle of Sheriffmuir in November ended inconclusively, with both sides claiming victory. But the failure to win a decisive triumph allowed the government to bring reinforcements north. By the time James himself arrived in Scotland in January 1716, his cause was already lost. He stayed only 6 weeks before fleeing back to France, leaving his supporters to face the consequences of their rebellion. The government responded with executions, imprisonments, and the forfeiture of estates, though the repression remained limited compared to what would come later. 3 decades of relative peace followed, during which Scotland began to experience the economic benefits that union had promised. Glasgow emerged as a major center of the tobacco trade, its merchants growing wealthy on imports from Virginia and Maryland. Edinburgh developed as a professional and cultural capital, home to lawyers, doctors, and clergy who served the institutions that union had preserved. The roads improved, the harvests stabilized, and a new generation grew up knowing Britain rather than Scotland as their nation. Yet, Jacobite sentiment never entirely disappeared, particularly in the Highlands, where clan chiefs maintained their traditional authority and Gaelic culture remained vibrant. When Charles Edward Stuart, the young and charismatic grandson of James VII, landed in Scotland in July 1745, he found supporters willing to risk everything for the Stuart cause. The clans gathered once more, and the last great Jacobite rising began its dramatic and doomed march through British history. Bonnie Prince Charlie, as he became known, possessed the personal magnetism that his father had lacked. He inspired devotion among his followers and won a stunning victory at Prestonpans that gave him control of Scotland. Against the advice of his Scottish councillors, he led his army south into England, hoping that English Jacobites would rise to join him. They did not. The Highland army reached Derby, just 120 miles from London, before the prince's advisors convinced him to retreat. The retreat from Derby sealed the rising's fate, though the end took months to arrive. Government forces under the Duke of Cumberland pursued the Jacobites north, finally bringing them to battle on Culloden Moor near Inverness in April 1746. The engagement lasted less than an hour. British artillery tore through the Highland ranks, and when the clansmen charged, they were cut down by disciplined musket fire. Perhaps 2,000 Jacobites died on the field or in the brutal pursuit that followed. Cumberland earned a nickname, Butcher, for his conduct after Culloden. His soldiers killed the wounded, burned the homes of suspected rebels, and drove cattle from the glens to starve the Highland population into submission. The government followed military victory with legislation designed to destroy the clan system forever. The wearing of Highland dress was forbidden. The carrying of weapons banned, and the heritable jurisdictions that had given chiefs power over their people were abolished. The destruction of the old Highland way of life proceeded rapidly in the decades after Culloden. Chiefs, who had once been fathers to their clans, became landlords interested primarily in the rents their estates could generate. The ties of kinship and obligation that had bound Highland society gave way to the cash relationships of commercial agriculture. The transformation happened gradually, its full consequences not apparent until the following century. But its roots lay in the defeat of 1746 and the determination of the British state to ensure that the Highlands would never again threaten its stability. While the Highlands endured this wrenching transformation, the Scottish lowlands entered an age of extraordinary intellectual achievement. The Scottish Enlightenment, as it came to be called, produced thinkers whose ideas reshaped the modern world. Edinburgh became known as the Athens of the North, a city where philosophers debated in coffee houses and professors attracted students from throughout Europe and America. David Hume challenged the foundations of human knowledge with a skepticism so rigorous that it troubled even his fellow philosophers. His arguments about causation, about the limits of reason, about the basis of morality, continue to influence philosophical debate to this day. Yet, Hume was also a historian and essayist of remarkable grace, his prose style setting a standard for English philosophical writing that few have matched. Adam Smith transformed understanding of how economies function with his inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, published in 1776, the same year that American colonies declared their independence. Smith's work argued that free markets and the division of labor created prosperity more effectively than government regulation. His invisible hand became one of the most influential metaphors in the history of economic thought, shaping policies and debates that continue into the present. The Scottish Enlightenment extended far beyond philosophy and economics. Edinburgh's medical school became the finest in the English-speaking world, training physicians who spread Scottish methods throughout the British Empire and beyond. Scottish engineers developed the technologies that would power the Industrial Revolution, including James Watt's improvements to the steam engine that made it a practical source of power. Scottish architects designed buildings from Edinburgh's New Town to the cities of colonial America. The transformation of Scottish agriculture matched these intellectual achievements in its long-term significance. Landowners who had read the works of agricultural improvers began draining marshes, enclosing fields, and introducing new crops in rotations. The potato arrived from Ireland and spread rapidly through the highlands and lowlands alike, providing cheap calories that supported population growth. New breeds of cattle and sheep replaced the scraggly animals that had grazed Scottish hills for centuries. These agricultural improvements displaced many who had worked the land under traditional arrangements. Cotters and subtenants found themselves evicted as landlords consolidated holdings and introduced more efficient farming methods. Some moved to the growing towns, where textile mills and other industries offered employment. Others emigrated, joining the streams of Scots who crossed the Atlantic to settle in the American colonies and, after independence, the new United States. The relationship between Scotland and the expanding British Empire grew ever closer as the century progressed. Scots served disproportionately as soldiers, administrators, and merchants throughout the imperial system. Highland regiments, formed from the same warrior culture that had charged at Culloden, now fought for the British crown from India to the Caribbean. The very qualities that had made Highlanders dangerous rebels now made them valued servants of empire. By 1800, Scotland had been transformed almost beyond recognition from the impoverished kingdom that had stumbled into union a century earlier. Its cities hummed with commerce and intellectual activity. Its countryside produced more food than ever before, though the benefits flowed mainly to landowners rather than laborers. Its people had spread throughout the globe, carrying Scottish names and Scottish ideas to every continent. Glasgow's growth exemplified the changes sweeping through Scottish society. The city that had been a modest cathedral town at the time of union swelled into one of the great commercial centers of the Atlantic world. Its merchants built elegant townhouses and endowed institutions of learning. The River Clyde, deepened and straightened by engineering works, allowed ocean-going vessels to reach the heart of the city. The foundations were being laid for the industrial colossus that Glasgow would become in the following century. Edinburgh underwent its own transformation, expanding beyond the crowded medieval old town into the spacious streets of the new town. Architects like Robert Adam designed buildings of classical elegance that proclaimed Scotland's cultural confidence. The contrast between the dark, vertical old town and the bright, horizontal new town became a symbol of the nation's journey from medieval poverty to Enlightenment prosperity. The city that had rioted against union now celebrated its place at the heart of British intellectual life. The union that had seemed such a betrayal in 1707 had become the framework within which Scotland flourished. Yet the price of that flourishing remained contested. The Highland Clearances were only beginning, and their full horror lay in the century ahead. The industrial cities that offered employment also offered squalor and disease. The empire that provided opportunity also demanded blood and complicity in conquest. Scotland had found a place in the modern world, but that place brought costs as well as benefits that would shape the nation's story for generations to come. The Highlands that faced transformation in the late 18th century possessed a culture stretching back beyond the reach of written records. Gaelic, the language of the region, connected Scottish Highlanders to an ancient Celtic world that had once spanned much of Europe. Its poetry preserved traditions of praise and lament, of heroic deeds and tragic losses that bards had sung in the halls of chiefs for countless generations. This was not a primitive culture, but a sophisticated one, different in its values and expressions from the English-speaking lowlands, but no less rich in meaning. The clan system organized Highland society around bonds of kinship, both real and imagined. The chief stood at the apex, theoretically the father of his people, responsible for their welfare in peace and their leadership in war. Below him ranged the tacksmen, gentlemen, farmers who held land from the chief and provided the officers when the clan mustered for battle. The common people, the clansmen who worked the land and followed their chief into combat, owed loyalty that transcended any legal obligation. They were family, bound by blood and tradition to stand together against the outside world. This society had never been wealthy by lowland standards. The land was poor, the climate harsh, the growing season short. Cattle provided the main source of wealth, driven south each autumn to the great markets at Crieff and Falkirk. The black cattle of the Highlands, small and hardy beasts adapted to the rough terrain, represented the accumulated capital of the clan economy. Young men proved their worth by raiding the herds of rival clans, a practice that lowlanders viewed as theft, but Highlanders understood as a test of courage and skill. The aftermath of Culloden began the destruction of this world, but the process accelerated dramatically in the decades that followed. Chiefs who had once measured their importance by the number of fighting men they could summon now calculated their worth in rental income. The tacksmen, squeezed between rising rents demanded by chiefs and the limited capacity of their subtenants to pay, began immigrating to the American colonies. They took with them the military leadership of the clans, leaving behind a population increasingly vulnerable to the decisions of landlords, who viewed them as obstacles to agricultural improvement. The first clearances often went unrecorded, small evictions that removed families from land their ancestors had worked for generations. The taxman's lease would expire, and instead of renewal, he would receive notice to quit. So tenants would scatter, some finding places on other estates, others drifting to the towns, still others joining the growing streams of immigrants crossing the Atlantic. Each such removal tore at the fabric of clan society, breaking connections that had given meaning and structure to Highland life. The scale of displacement grew dramatically after 1800, driven by the discovery that Highland estates could generate far greater profits from sheep than from people. The Cheviot sheep, a breed from the English borders, thrived on Highland pastures and produced wool that fetched high prices in the mills of the industrial lowlands. Landowners who introduced these animals needed vast expanses of grazing land, and the small farms of their tenants stood in the way. The logic of improvement demanded that people make way for sheep. The Sutherland Clearances became the most notorious example of this transformation. Elizabeth, Countess of Sutherland, and her husband, the Marquis of Stafford, controlled nearly all of Sutherland, the vast county that occupied the northeastern corner of the Highlands between 1811 and 1820. Their factors systematically removed the interior population, burning homes to prevent return and relocating families to small plots on the coast where they were expected to take up fishing. Perhaps 15,000 people were displaced in these operations. The methods employed shocked even contemporaries accustomed to harsh treatment of the poor. Patrick Seller, the factor most associated with the Sutherland Clearances, faced trial for culpable homicide after an elderly woman died when her home was set alight with her still inside. He was acquitted by a jury of fellow landowners, but the case revealed the brutality that accompanied improvement. Seller defended his actions as necessary for progress, arguing that he was dragging a backward people into the modern age, whether they wished it or not. The human cost of the clearances defies easy calculation. Families that had occupied the same land for centuries found themselves homeless, their possessions piled in the rain while their cottages burned behind them. The elderly and the sick suffered most, unable to adapt to the new circumstances thrust upon them. The psychological trauma of displacement, of watching everything familiar destroyed in the name of someone else's profit, left scars that passed down through generations. Those evicted from the interior, Glens faced limited choices. Some accepted the coastal settlements their landlords provided, attempting to learn fishing in waters they had never worked and on shores exposed to Atlantic storms. These new communities often failed, their inhabitants lacking the skills and equipment needed to harvest the sea. The plots allocated were too small for agriculture and too exposed for comfort. Many who began in these settlements eventually immigrated. Their brief coastal sojourn merely a way station on the journey to permanent exile. Immigration became the great escape valve for Highland population pressure. Ships left from ports throughout the west coast, carrying passengers to Nova Scotia, Cape Breton, Prince Edward Island, and the Carolinas. The voyage itself claimed many lives, as overcrowded vessels with inadequate provisions crossed the Atlantic in conditions that bred disease. Those who survived the passage faced the challenge of building new lives in unfamiliar landscapes, though they often found communities of fellow Highlanders who had preceded them. The Highland immigrants carried their culture across the ocean, establishing Gaelic-speaking communities that preserved traditions the homeland was losing. Churches in Cape Breton conducted services in Gaelic well into the 20th century. The music and stories of the Highlands found new life in the forests and farmlands of North America. In a bitter irony, the clearances that destroyed Highland society in Scotland helped spread its cultural legacy around the world. Not all Highlanders left willingly. The potato famine that struck Ireland in the 1840s also devastated the Scottish Highlands, where the population had become dangerously dependent on this single crop. When the blight arrived, destroying the tubers that provided the margin between survival and starvation, the Highlands faced catastrophe. Landlords who might once have felt some obligation to their people now saw only an opportunity to clear their estates of unprofitable tenants. The famine years witnessed some of the most coercive clearances in Highland history. Starving families were offered free passage to Canada or Australia as an alternative to death by hunger. Some landlords paid for immigration out of genuine, if paternalistic, concern for their tenants' welfare. Others simply wanted to rid themselves of a population that could no longer pay rent and had become a burden on the poor rates. The ships that sailed from Highland ports in these years carried the desperate and the dying, many of whom perished before reaching their destinations. Yet, even as the living Highlands emptied, a romantic vision of Highland culture captured the imagination of the outside world. Sir Walter Scott, whose novels had made Scottish history fashionable throughout Europe, orchestrated the visit of King George IV to Edinburgh in 1822. The festivities wrapped the Hanoverian monarch in Highland trappings, dressing him in tartan and surrounding him with clan chiefs as though the Jacobite Wars had never happened. The king's evident enthusiasm for this theatrical version of Scottish identity helped transform the Highland image from barbarous threat to picturesque tradition. Queen Victoria continued this romanticization, falling in love with the Highlands during her first visit in 1842 and eventually building Balmoral Castle as a royal retreat in the Cairngorms. Her passion for all things Scottish, from tartan furnishings to Highland games, gave royal approval to a sanitized version of Highland culture stripped of its political and social context. The land that had been cleared of its people became a playground for aristocratic hunting parties, its emptiness recast as wild natural beauty rather than the result of deliberate depopulation. The tartan and clan identity that had been banned after Culloden now became fashionable accessories for tourists and lowlanders who had no connection to Highland tradition. Textile manufacturers invented clan tartans, assigning specific patterns to surnames in a systematic way that had no historical basis. The kilt, once the everyday dress of Highland men, became ceremonial costume worn at weddings and formal occasions. Highland culture survived, but in a form that would have been unrecognizable to those who had actually lived it. The sporting estates that replaced the populated glens created their own economy, one that employed gamekeepers, gillies, and household servants, but supported far fewer people than the old clan system. Deer forests expanded across land that had once grown crops, their boundaries enforced by factors who had driven out the previous inhabitants. The wealthy came north each autumn to stalk deer and shoot grouse, enjoying a wilderness that human hands had created through the removal of human presence. Those Highlanders who remained adapted as best they could to the transformed landscape, crofting, a system of small-scale agriculture combined with other occupations, became the characteristic way of life in the regions that escaped complete clearance. Crofters held their land on terms that left them vulnerable to eviction, their security depending on the goodwill of landlords who had demonstrated how little such goodwill could be trusted. The struggle for crofters' rights would become a major political issue later in the century. The Gaelic language declined steadily as the population that spoke it immigrated or died. Schools taught in English, churches increasingly preached in English, and ambitious young people recognized that English offered opportunities that Gaelic could not provide. Each generation spoke Gaelic less fluently than the one before. By the late 19th century, the language that had defined Highland identity for over 1,000 years faced the prospect of extinction. The music of the Highlands underwent its own transformation during these decades. The great piping traditions that had accompanied clan armies into battle found new contexts in military, bands, and competitive gatherings. The Highland Games, which had roots in genuine clan assemblies, became formalized events where athletes competed in feats of strength while pipe bands marched and dancers performed. These gatherings preserved cultural forms while stripping them of their original social functions, turning living traditions into heritage displays. The songs that Highland women had sung while working, the walking songs that accompanied the fulling of cloth, and the milking songs that soothed cattle, fell silent as the communities that had created them dispersed. Collectors began recording what remained of this oral tradition, preserving fragments of a culture that was disappearing before their eyes. Their work would prove invaluable to later generations, seeking to understand what had been lost. Though no written record could capture the living context in which these songs had meaning, the Highlands that emerged from the clearances bore little resemblance to the land that Bonnie Prince Charlie had known, where once a complex society had flourished, shaped by its own values and sustained by its own traditions. Now stood empty glens and sheep-covered hillsides. The people had gone, scattered across the globe, or concentrated in the industrial cities of the lowlands. What remained was landscape, beautiful and haunting, but emptied of the human presence that had given it meaning. The trauma of this transformation echoed through Scottish memory, shaping how the nation understood itself in its relationship with the powerful forces that had reshaped its most distinctive region. While the Highlands emptied, the cities of the Scottish lowlands swelled with unprecedented growth. Glasgow, which had numbered fewer than 80,000 souls at the turn of the 19th century, exploded to over 500,000 by 1870 and nearly 1 million by 1900. This transformation made it the second city of the British Empire, a metropolis of industry and commerce that rivaled any in the world. The same decades that witnessed the tragedy of the clearances also saw Scotland become one of the most industrialized nations on earth. The River Clyde formed the heart of this industrial revolution. Shipyards lined its banks 4 miles, their hammering and riveting creating a constant percussion that defined the rhythm of Glasgow life. The techniques developed here, particularly the use of iron and later steel in ship construction, gave Clyde-built vessels a reputation for quality that attracted orders from around the globe. By the late 19th century, the Clyde produced more ships than any other river in the world, launching vessels that sailed every ocean and carried the commerce of empire. The transition from wooden sailing ships to iron steamships happened largely on the Clyde, driven by Scottish engineers and entrepreneurs who recognized the potential of new technologies. Robert Napier, sometimes called the father of Clyde shipbuilding, trained a generation of engineers who spread out to establish yards throughout the river. His apprentices included men who had found legendary firms like John Elder and Company, Fairfield, and Denny of Dumbarton. The skills developed in these yards became Scotland's most valuable export. The demand for ships created demand for steel. Scotland developed one of the largest steel industries in Britain. Lanarkshire, the county surrounding Glasgow, became a landscape of ironworks and coal mines, their furnaces glowing through the night and their chimneys darkening the sky with smoke. The discovery of black band ironstone in the region had sparked the industry's growth, and Scottish innovations in smelting technology kept it competitive, even as richer ores were discovered elsewhere. Coal mining expanded dramatically to feed the hungry furnaces of industry. Miners descended into the earth throughout Lanarkshire, Ayrshire, and Fife, working in conditions of danger and darkness that shortened lives and broke bodies. Mining communities developed their own distinctive cultures, marked by solidarity, forged in shared hardship, and the ever-present threat of disaster. The pit disasters that claimed dozens or hundreds of lives at a time reminded everyone of the human cost that industrial progress demanded. The textile industry that had sparked Scotland's initial industrialization continued to flourish, though it shifted from cotton to more specialized products. Dundee became the world capital of jute manufacturing, processing the rough fiber imported from Bengal into sacking, carpet, backing, and countless other products. The jute mills employed thousands of women and girls, their labor cheap and their fingers nimble enough for the delicate work of tending the looms. The city's fortunes rose and fell with the global demand for this humble material. The Scottish contribution to Victorian technology extended far beyond shipbuilding and heavy industry. James Young developed the process for extracting oil from shale, creating an industry that lit lamps throughout Britain before petroleum from America rendered it obsolete. William Thomson, later Lord Kelvin, laid the theoretical foundations for the laws of thermodynamics and supervised the laying of the first transatlantic telegraph cable. James Clerk Maxwell unified electricity and magnetism in equations that made modern electronics possible. Scottish minds shaped the scientific understanding of the age. The wealth generated by industry created a new class of powerful men who reshaped Scottish society. The great industrialists built mansions in the countryside and endowed institutions in the cities. Andrew Carnegie, born in a weaver's cottage in Dunfermline, immigrated to America and became the richest man in the world through his steel empire. He gave away most of his fortune, funding libraries throughout Scotland and the English-speaking world. His belief that wealth brought obligations to society reflected values shaped by his Scottish upbringing. The universities that had nurtured the Enlightenment adapted to serve the needs of industrial society. Glasgow and Edinburgh trained engineers, doctors, and lawyers who staffed the institutions of empire. Anderson's Institution in Glasgow, later the University of Strathclyde, spoke specifically on practical and technical education. Scottish graduates found positions throughout the British world. Their reputation for thorough training and hard work opening doors from Hong Kong to Cape Town. The Scottish diaspora of the 19th century rivaled any migration in human history. Millions left Scotland during this period, driven by clearances, famine, and a simple desire for better opportunities than their homeland could provide. They settled throughout the British Empire and beyond, establishing communities that maintained Scottish traditions while adapting to new circumstances. The names they carried and the institutions they founded marked their presence across the globe. Canada received perhaps the largest share of Scottish immigrants, particularly in Nova Scotia, whose very name proclaimed its Scottish character. The Highland Clearances had sent Gaelic-speaking communities to Cape Breton and Prince Edward Island, where they maintained their language and music into the 20th century. Later waves brought Lowland Scots to Ontario and the western provinces, where they became farmers, merchants, and professionals. The fur trade that opened the Canadian West relied heavily on Scottish employees of the Hudson's Bay Company and the North West Company. Australia and New Zealand attracted Scots seeking land and opportunity in the southern hemisphere. The sheep stations of Australia employed techniques developed in the Scottish borders, and Scottish shepherds found their skills in high demand. New Zealand's Otago region became particularly Scottish in character. Its main city, Dunedin, named after the Gaelic name for Edinburgh. The Presbyterian churches and educational institutions these settlers established gave their new homes a distinctively Scottish flavor. The empire offered careers to ambitious Scots in numbers far exceeding their proportion of the British population. Scottish merchants dominated trade in many colonial ports. Scottish doctors staffed hospitals from Calcutta to Kingston. Scottish soldiers served in every regiment, and Scottish officers commanded armies on every continent. The partnership between Scotland and England that the Union had created proved spectacularly successful. In building and administering the largest empire the world had ever seen. This imperial involvement brought prosperity to Scotland, but also implicated the nation in the violence and exploitation that empire required. Scottish planters owned enslaved people in the Caribbean and American South before abolition. Scottish traders profited from the opium trade that devastated China. Scottish soldiers suppressed rebellions from India to Africa, enforcing British rule on peoples who had never consented to it. The wealth that built Glasgow's grand Victorian buildings came from sources that later generations would find deeply troubling. The social conditions in Scotland's industrial cities created their own forms of misery. Glasgow's slums ranked among the worst in Europe. Overcrowded tenements where families of 10 or more shared single rooms. Disease flourished in these conditions, with cholera, typhus, and tuberculosis claiming thousands of lives. Life expectancy in the poorest districts barely exceeded 30 years, creating a stark contrast with the comfortable lives of the wealthy in their suburban villas. Reform movements arose to address these inequities, drawing on Scottish traditions of education and moral improvement. The temperance movement found fertile ground in Scotland, where whiskey consumption had reached alarming levels. Churches established missions in the slums, offering both spiritual guidance and practical assistance. Municipal authorities gradually expanded their responsibilities, providing clean water, sewage systems, and eventually public housing to combat the worst effects of industrial urbanization. The labor movement grew powerful in Scotland's industrial heartland. Miners, shipyard workers, and factory hands organized unions to fight for better wages and safer conditions. The skilled workers of the Clyde developed a particularly militant tradition, their indispensability to the shipbuilding industry, giving them leverage that less skilled workers lacked. The Independent Labour Party, founded in Bradford in 1893, drew heavily on Scottish support and Scottish leaders like Keir Hardie, a former miner from Lanarkshire, who became the first independent Labour member of Parliament. Education remained a source of Scottish pride and a pathway to advancement for the talented poor. The parish school system established after the Reformation had given Scotland rates of literacy that exceeded most of Europe. The Education Act of 1872 made schooling compulsory and established elected school boards throughout the country. Scottish universities continued to admit students from humble backgrounds at rates that English institutions could not match, creating opportunities for social mobility that reinforced the national belief in the value of learning. The literary and artistic culture of Victorian Scotland reflected both national pride and imperial confidence. Robert Louis Stevenson captured imaginations with tales of adventure and romance, from the Scottish Highlands of Kidnapped to the South Seas, where he spent his final years. Arthur Conan Doyle, trained as a doctor in Edinburgh, created Sherlock Holmes and became one of the most widely read authors in the world. The Glasgow Boys revolutionized Scottish painting, bringing continental influences to bear undistinctively Scottish subjects and challenging the conservative establishment of the Royal Scottish Academy. Architecture transformed the face of Scottish cities during this period. Alexander Thomson, known as Greek Thomson for his classical inspirations, gave Glasgow a distinctive architectural character that set it apart from other British cities. Charles Rennie Mackintosh developed his own revolutionary style, blending arts and crafts principles with Art Nouveau influences to create buildings of startling originality. His Glasgow School of Art, completed in 1909, demonstrated that Scottish creativity could lead rather than follow international trends. The Church of Scotland underwent its own transformations during the Victorian era. The disruption of 1843 saw over 400 ministers walk out of the General Assembly to form the Free Church of Scotland, protesting against the right of landowners to impose ministers on unwilling congregations. This dramatic split reflected deeper tensions about the relationship between church and state, between religious conscience and secular authority. The rival churches competed for adherents throughout the rest of the century, holding kirks and schools that dotted the Scottish landscape. By the early 20th century, Scotland had developed an identity that balanced distinctiveness with integration into the larger British state. The tartanry, promoted by Victoria and her successors, provided symbols of Scottish nationality that could be celebrated without threatening the unity of the United Kingdom. Football and rugby gave Scots opportunities to compete against England in ways that satisfied national pride without political consequences. The Scottish press, the Scottish legal system, and the Scottish churches maintained institutional differences that reminded everyone that Scotland was not simply a northern extension of England. The world that Scottish industry had helped build seemed permanent and prosperous as the new century dawned. The empire appeared unshakable, the navy supreme, the economy powerful. Young men graduating from Scottish schools and universities looked forward to careers that would take them around the globe, following paths that earlier generations had pioneered. They could not know that the system they inherited stood on the brink of catastrophe, that the summer of 1914 would end an era and begin a century of change more dramatic than anything Scotland had experienced since the Union itself. The crofters of the Highlands, meanwhile, had finally won some measure of security through political agitation. The Crofters Holdings Act of 1886, passed after years of protest and civil disobedience, gave tenants protection from arbitrary eviction and the right to pass their crofts to their heirs. This legislation, inspired partly by the Irish land reform movement, represented a rare victory for Highland interests against the power of landlords. The land question that had defined so much of 19th century Scottish history remained unresolved. But the worst abuses of the clearance era could no longer be repeated. The Scotland that faced the 20th century was thus a nation of profound contrasts. The industrial lowlands hummed with activity, their populations packed into cities that had grown faster than their infrastructure could accommodate. The Highlands stood largely empty, their people scattered across the globe, while sporting estates and sheep farms occupied the land. Scottish institutions maintained their distinctiveness within the British framework, while Scottish individuals achieved prominence throughout the empire they had helped to build. Its complex inheritance would shape how Scotland responded to the challenges that the new century would bring. The summer of 1914 brought war to Europe on a scale that no one had imagined possible. Scotland, bound to Britain and its empire, marched into the conflict with an enthusiasm that would soon curdle into horror. Young men from the tenements of Glasgow and the glens of the Highlands volunteered in their hundreds of thousands, believing they would be home by Christmas and eager to prove their courage in what they expected to be a brief and glorious adventure. They could not know that they were walking into the most destructive conflict in human history. Scottish regiments earned fearsome reputations in the trenches of the Western Front. The kilted soldiers of the Highland divisions became known to German troops as the ladies from hell, their distinctive dress making them instantly recognizable in the chaos of battle. The 51st Highland Division and the 15th Scottish Division fought at the Somme, at Arras, at Passchendaele, their casualty rates among the highest in the British Army. The bagpipes that had once rallied clansmen at Culloden now sounded across the mud and wire of Flanders. The losses Scotland suffered during the Great War exceeded its proportion of the British population. Some estimates suggest that Scotland lost over 100,000 dead, roughly 1 in every 50 of its people. Entire communities were devastated, their young men wiped out in single engagements. The war memorials that rose in every Scottish village and town after the armistice bore witness to a generation cut short, their names carved in stone as a permanent reminder of sacrifice. The war transformed Scottish society in ways that extended far beyond the battlefield. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking positions in munitions factories and shipyards that had previously been reserved for men. The Clyde shipyards worked around the clock to replace the vessels lost to German submarines, their workers essential to the war effort, yet increasingly militant in their demands for better conditions. The rent strikes led by Glasgow women in 1915 forced the government to introduce rent controls, a victory for working-class organization that would have lasting consequences. The radicalism of wartime Glasgow intensified after the armistice. The city had earned the nickname Red Clydeside for the strength of its socialist and labor movements. In January 1919, a general strike demanding a 40-hour work week brought the city to a standstill, but the government, fearing revolution, deployed tanks and troops to George Square, treating Glasgow as occupied territory. The red flag flew briefly over the city chambers before the strike collapsed. The episode revealed the depth of working-class discontent and the government's willingness to use force against its own citizens. The interwar years brought economic depression that hit Scotland with particular severity. The industries that had made Scotland prosperous, shipbuilding and coal and steel, faced collapse as global demand dried up and competition intensified. Unemployment in some areas exceeded 30%, creating misery that scarred a generation. The hunger marches and demonstrations of the 1930s expressed a desperation that the political system seemed unable to address. Immigration resumed on a massive scale as Scots sought opportunities that their homeland could no longer provide. The Second World War brought renewed purpose to Scottish industry, though at terrible cost. The Clyde shipyards launched vessels for the Royal Navy while becoming targets for German bombers. The Clydebank Blitz of March 1941 killed over 500 people and left 35,000 homeless, destroying much of the town in 2 nights of concentrated bombing. Scottish soldiers fought in every theater of the war, from the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of Burma, continuing the military traditions that had defined Scottish masculinity for generations. The post-war settlement transformed Scotland, along with the rest of Britain. The Labour government elected in 1945 nationalized the industries that had been the foundation of Scottish prosperity, bringing coal, steel, and railways under public ownership. The National Health Service provided free medical care for the first time, a reform that commanded overwhelming Scottish support. New council housing replaced the worst of the Victorian slums, though the tower blocks that rose in their place would create problems of their own. The decades that followed brought continued economic decline to Scotland's traditional industries. Shipbuilding contracted steadily as Asian competitors offered lower costs and Britain's empire dissolved. The mines that had employed tens of thousands closed one by one as coal became uneconomical. Steel plants shut their gates, leaving former industrial heartlands struggling to find new purposes. The confident industrial Scotland of the Victorian era had become a landscape of unemployment and dereliction. Yet, transformation was coming from an unexpected direction. In 1969, exploration in the North Sea revealed vast reserves of oil and gas beneath waters that international law would allocate largely to Scotland. The discovery transformed the economic calculations of Scottish politics overnight. Here was wealth on a scale that could support an independent nation if Scotland chose to claim it. Scotland that emerged, its Scotland's oil, captured a new sense of possibility that reinvigorated movements for Scottish self-government. The Scottish National Party, which had existed since the 1930s but never achieved significant electoral success, suddenly found its message resonating with voters. The party won seats at Westminster and came to represent a challenge to the constitutional settlement that had governed Scotland since 1707. Support for independence remained a minority position, but support for some form of self-government grew steadily. The old certainties about Scotland's place within Britain began to crumble. The Labour government of the 1970s attempted to address Scottish demands through devolution, proposing an elected assembly with limited powers. The referendum of 1979 produced a narrow majority in favor, but turnout was insufficient to meet the threshold that Parliament had imposed. Scotland had voted yes, but not decisively enough, and the proposal died. The failure left a sense of frustration that would shape Scottish politics for decades to come. The Thatcher years intensified Scottish alienation from Westminster government. The policies that transformed England, the breaking of union power, the privatization of nationalized industries, The promotion of finance over manufacturing fell heavily on Scotland without ever commanding Scottish electoral support. The closure of the Ravenscrag steelworks in 1992 became a symbol of this divergence, a facility that had once employed thousands reduced to rubble while Scots watched helplessly. The poll tax, introduced in Scotland a year before England, sparked protests that demonstrated the limits of Scottish patience with a government it had not chosen. The return of Labour in 1997 finally delivered the devolution that had been promised 2 decades earlier. Scottish Parliament, abolished in 1707, reconvened in 1999 with powers over health, education, law, and local government. The new Parliament met first in the Church of Scotland's Assembly Hall before moving to a controversial new building at Holyrood, designed by the Catalan architect Enric Morales. Scotland had its own democratic institution once more, a forum where Scottish voices could shape Scottish policy. The early years of devolution saw Labour and Liberal Democrat coalitions govern Scotland, implementing policies that diverged increasingly from those in England. Scottish students paid no tuition fees, while English students faced rising costs. Scottish elderly received free personal care that their English counterparts had to fund themselves. These differences demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of devolution, showing what Scotland could achieve while remaining dependent on Westminster for revenue and major policy decisions. The Scottish National Party's victory in 2007 transformed the political landscape once more. For the first time, a party committed to independence governed Scotland, though initially as a minority administration dependent on other parties for support. The SNP proved more competent in government than many had expected, winning a majority in 2011 that gave it the mandate to demand a referendum on independence. The referendum campaign of 2014 engaged Scotland in a debate about its future more profound than anything since the Union itself. The question was simple: should Scotland be an independent country? But the implications were enormously complex, touching on currency, membership in European institutions, the sharing of national debt, the future of the welfare state, and countless other issues. Scots discussed politics in pubs and workplaces, at kitchen tables, and on social media with an intensity that surprised even those who had called for the vote. The result, in September 2014, was a victory for the Union by 55% to 45%. Scotland had chosen to remain part of Britain, though the margin was closer than many had expected, and the engagement was far higher than most elections produced. The question that was supposed to be settled for a generation refused to stay settled. Support for independence remained substantial, and events would soon conspire to reopen debates that the referendum was meant to close. The Brexit vote of 2016 created new constitutional tensions that have not been resolved. Scotland voted decisively to remain in the European Union, while England voted to leave. This divergence raised questions about whether the union that Scotland had voted to preserve in 2014 still existed in the same form. The SNP demanded a second independence referendum, arguing that circumstances had fundamentally changed. The UK government refused, insisting that the 2014 vote remained valid. Contemporary Scotland exists in a state of constitutional uncertainty, unprecedented since the Union itself. The questions of independence and union remain live political issues, capable of shaping elections and dominating public discourse. The Scottish Parliament has established itself as a permanent feature of Scottish governance, yet its relationship with Westminster remains contested. Whether Scotland's future lies within the United Kingdom or as an independent nation remains genuinely undecided. Beyond the constitutional debates, Scottish culture has flourished in recent decades with a confidence that earlier generations might not have imagined. Scottish writers have won major literary prizes and attracted global audiences. Scottish musicians have shaped popular culture from rock to electronic dance music. Scottish artists and filmmakers have gained international recognition while remaining rooted in distinctively Scottish concerns. The cultural revival that began in the 1980s has created a Scotland more aware of its own traditions and more confident in expressing them. The Gaelic language, which seemed destined for extinction a century ago, has experienced modest revival through dedicated effort. Gaelic medium education now exists in schools throughout Scotland. Gaelic broadcasting provides television and radio in the language. The numbers who speak Gaelic remain small, but the decline has slowed and perhaps reversed. The language that carried Highland culture for over 1,000 years may yet survive into the 22nd century and beyond. The Scotland that looks toward the future carries the weight of its entire history. The Pictish stones still stand in Angus fields, their symbols still undeciphered. The Declaration of Arbroath still proclaims that Scots will never submit to English domination. The blood of Culloden and Culloden still stains the ground where Scottish armies fell. The empty glens still testify to the clearances that scattered a people across the globe. The shipyards of the Clyde still echo with the memory of the vessels they once launched. This weight of history shapes but does not determine what Scotland will become. Each generation must decide for itself how to honor the past while building the future. The debates about independence and union, about tradition and change, about Scotland's place in Europe and the world, are not questions with predetermined answers. They are choices that Scots must make for themselves, drawing on the wisdom of their ancestors while facing circumstances those ancestors could never have imagined. The story of Scotland continues, written not in ancient chronicles, but in the decisions of ordinary people living ordinary lives. It continues in the classrooms where children learn their nations. History in the Parliament where representatives debate its future. It continues in the homes of the diaspora, where Scottish names and Scottish memories persist generations after departure. It continues in the land itself, the mountains and lochs and islands that have witnessed everything that has come before and will witness everything yet to come. The story has no ending because nations, like the people who compose them, are always in the process of becoming something new while remaining somehow themselves. Scotland endures, as it has endured through invasion and union, through clearance and industry, through war and peace, carrying its past into whatever future awaits.